Maybe? Yes, there we go. Finally, it says we are live. And I'm going to believe it. I'm going to trust it. It says we're live, so we're live and we're going on in 3, 2, 1. Well, now we've got 17 games to work with in the National Football League. And how should Fantasy GMs set up their schedule? All that and more. It is the Audible Live here. Cecil, Lammey, Sigmund, Bloom, Matt Waldman together, gentlemen. And it's great for everybody to be here. Matt, it's great to see your face as always.
Well, I appreciate it. It's always nice to see you guys, and another game. Sitting there just wreaking havoc on projections. That's all I can say is that, should you count 17 games for these guys, or should you consider that probably that last game for most of the league is going to be filled with backups,
Right.
And that's kind of where I'm looking at it, but I'm curious what you guys are going to think about it.
Well, and Bloom, let's jump in there because you're working on projections right now for footballguys.com. Like, how are you handling this? And by the way, because there's a lot of people that you'll be shocked. They don't think about fantasy football as much as we do. So as we go, I'm sure we're going to get these questions in July. I'm sure we're going to have this conversation again, just kind of recap it. Here's how you should approach your league. But just from the work that you're doing, how does it change with 17 games now instead of 16?
Well, I have to tip the cap to Austin Lee and Clayton Gray, because I would say the best way to handle it is work for Football Guys and have Austin Lee and Clayton Gray having your back, because but it's simple math. I mean, you're going to normalize the projections. Oh, I don't know exactly what it is, like an extra 6 point something percent, whatever you do the math in your head. So that we're going to stay with the typical baselines. It's going to be interesting to see if it changes how people look at single season records or milestones like 1,000-yard season or 100 catches and things like that. But what you check yourself as you go through, and at the very least, unless you're projecting regression for a player or an offense, last year is a baseline, and you're going to go up from that. And it makes you question your numbers a little bit. Am I really going to have Keenan Allen catching 130 balls or something like that? So I think that some of the numbers might take some getting used to. As far as the fantasy football schedule goes, the high-stakes contests are always going to, and this was already the thing with Week 13 buys, where your bye week might happen during the playoffs, depending on how your league sets it up. And I think that you certainly are going to look at Adam Harstad, Q Adam Harstad. I wish we could have his head float in, and he could just talk about this. It's just simple math that the playoff weeks are the most important weeks. And as he points out, something to the effect of, and I think he's going to write something about this to help guide people. If you tell me that someone's best week, a team's best week in fantasy is going to be week 16, that might increase their chances of winning the championship to 20%. If you tell me that their best week's in week 4, well, it will incrementally increase their chances of winning in some way, but not nearly as important as if that best week happens during the playoffs. Likewise, if there's a player who's on bye during the playoffs, you could say, hey, they can help you get to the playoffs because they played all 13 weeks before the fantasy playoffs started. But if your team can't get to the playoffs unless they don't miss their bye, then you're probably not really a championship contender. So I think we're definitely, for your leagues that have the playoffs starting week 14, with some teams on a week 14 bye this year, you're definitely going to look at those players in a different light. It's going to be Indianapolis, New England, Miami, and Philadelphia. And those 4 teams may have buys that happen during the playoffs, and you may decide to start your playoffs in week 15 because of that. I think this is, it should be a robust discussion, but of course we'll be there to help guide you.
Always robust discussion when it's Sigmund Bloom and Matt Waldman and me running the show. So, Matt, let's talk about it and just how you're kind of approaching this year with Fantasy GMs having to go, okay, here's an extra game. And by the way, I don't think the NFL, it's not Major League Baseball. Bloom, there's your baseball reference.
Yeah.
The numbers aren't as historic. Like 2105 means something to me, Matt, you, but not really the general sporting populace out there. So, one day that record will be broken. I thought we got a couple of times, Matt. But how are you approaching this now with that extra game thrown in?
I'm taking a little bit more of a cautious approach, because the whole idea of Keenan Allen catching 130 balls certainly can happen. But I wouldn't be surprised if by, week 15, teams kind of know where they're at, just like they were last year. And we're going to see ourselves in a situation where guys are getting time off in the most important weeks. So I'm kind of projecting it as, a slight add-on to 16-week schedule, but giving more value to reserves and contributors in terms of how they're going to be used, giving them a little more volume with their production, as opposed to saying, you know what, let me just take last year's games, divide it by 16, look at this, and then say, okay, now I'm going to multiply it by 17.
Right.
And you could do that, and I think that's probably the less careful high end, whereas the less careful low end is just to eliminate week 16, 17 game, that 17th game altogether, and say there's only going to be there's going to be a lot of teams that are going to play it, but like your playoff teams, your most meaningful players might wind up sitting for that, for that week 17, week 16 part of it as well. So to me, it's kind of more like I'm erring on the side of caution, but knowing that instead of, maybe, I think it's just a kind of a different direction of adding on that 6% or whatever of how you look at it. But I think you have to understand that overall, some of these backup running backs, I'd have to think that you're going to see a much bigger reason why we're going to have committees, why we're going to have, fourth and fifth receivers are going to matter. Second tight ends are going to matter. Your backup quarterbacks. I mean, you're going to have to know about all of these guys a lot more than I think what you did, in previous years.
Yeah, and I think there's a second season almost when you flip the page, not necessarily a handcuff like Chuba Hubbard, let's say, behind Christian McCaffrey, but there'll be like our beginning season guy and then our closer. And as the NFL has modeled the NBA more and more, Bloom, right? Because now you have positionless football, basically. You have players that are kind of commanding where they're going to go, Aaron Rodgers, etc. Now is load management. Greg brings it up in our chat room here. Is load management going to take over like in the NBA? And well, really, should it?
Well, it should for certain positions, right? Or certain players. And we can go back to Chip Kelly, because Chip was doing that work to try to figure out exactly how to manage a player's practice load or manage a player's return from injury. And the data certainly has gotten better on that. So I think the good organizations, and we have to be careful just throwing all 32 organizations in one bucket and saying, this is how the NFL is going to handle it. Because you see a wide range, some wise, some foolish, of how teams handle all kinds of things that you have to handle when you run an NFL team. So I think that the good teams, the wise organizations are going to be a step ahead of this, and probably were. And I also think we can look back. Like, remember when Derrick Henry missed week 16 a few years back, and he was just a beast during the playoffs. He looked as good. That was the Tennessee run to the AFC title game. So I think maybe Dalvin Cook comes to mind. Some of these players that truly are the cog that makes the offense turn. That maybe, as someone else brought up in the chat room, that maybe a player gets his own bye. Maybe depending on when the bye falls, if you have an early bye, week 6, week 7, week 8, maybe around week 13, week 14, you give a player a bye. And I think teams are going to get better and better with actual objective data, understanding the benefits of this. I mean, see, I know I ruined our Peloton endorsement a few weeks back when we talked about the treadmill. But this is totally anecdata, okay? But I'm a creature of habit, right? So we got the Peloton bike, and if I don't do it every day, then I will stop doing it. Now, turns out that if you take a day off every now and then, you sort of realize the gains from the work you're putting in, right? Give your body a little bit of rest, and you re-strengthen, you build that back up. So I think that basic principle is going to apply in the NFL as players have to deal with this extra game, and it could be in some cases the straw that broke the camel's back. So I think we're going to be watching for this. Maybe teams will just have a higher threshold for when they return a player to injury, knowing that it's a longer stretch. Going back to something Matt said really quick, last year, when they added the 7th playoff spot and only one team was going to get a bye, I really thought that was going to create more teams resting their players. But likewise, I think teams are on to the idea that you don't want players coming in not having played for 2 or 3 weeks when the playoffs start. And last year, there was a ton up for grabs in week 17. This year it'll be week 18. There was a lot of playoff positioning, a lot of home field advantage. There were a lot of teams that we didn't know whether they were going to play their starters for part of the game, for all of the game. And obviously it's a team-by-team decision, but I was pleasantly surprised in how that change did not result in more meaningless games. We'll see how it works out. This year, it may be that the extra game allows there to be more separation in the standings by the time we get to week 18. So just like the NFL, we're going to see what happens and adjust accordingly.
I think the smart teams, we'll see the smarter teams or wiser teams decide, like as Bloom said, if a guy's got an ankle sprain week 4, week 5, they'll give him an extra week. I think that guys who have some minor injury where they can get them whole, they'll do that. They'll give them an extra 1, 2, 3 weeks in the middle of the season and go from there. The foolish teams will run these guys into the ground and then be stuck with a backup at a certain point. And I think that that's most likely what we're going to see as the widest range there. So for me, I think that it's, what are the positions where that's going to be the most difficult? Obviously running back, your running back situation. Will you definitely be looking for a handcuff? You'll be looking for good handcuffs, or you'll be drafting more talent, who can start for you and have that rotation for you in case, one of the guys that you like is, ends up getting worn down to a nub. And then I'd say in terms of quarterback, I mean, these guys, that's the interesting thing to me, is because usually most of these guys' arms are dead by week 16. You'll see that a lot, is that they just, even the better quarterbacks, they just don't have the velocity to put on the ball. So are there going to be times where I'd be interested to see if there's any outlier teams that are going to say, you know what, we're going to rest Joe Burrow for a couple of weeks in the middle of the season here. I don't think it's going to be the Bengals that do this, but again, you never know.
Could be the Browns.
Could be the Browns. We could rest him for Case Keenum.
Perfect guy to put in.
Yeah.
Perfect guy to put in for a couple of games. Let Baker, the baby maker, get some rest before the postseason. I could totally see it.
Yeah, and you do that, and then that way you can help him kind of rev back up, at the right time, as opposed to giving him time off at the end of the year. So I think this year and next are going to be the kinks worked out type of situation, where we're going to have some oddball situations where you bet on something and it just completely blows up in your face, and then something else works out fantastically and you're thinking this is awesome, and then the team decides to change it because behind the scenes they learned something that we didn't know, and we're going to be counting on. So I think we're going to be hearing a lot of hard and fast rules in 2022 and 2023 that aren't going to be so hard and so fast.
Yeah, this season is the experiment time. Mm-hmm. And I was just going to ask you that, Matt, too. It's like, I think desperate teams will do dumb stuff because that's what desperate teams do. But good teams, they know they're going to the dance. They know they've got a shot. The Bills, right? You're going to throw in Blake Bortles. Why not? Right? If you have a game that you think you can get by and just lean on the rushing attack a little bit more, you'll have 2-headed backfields. You have 3-headed backfields. We had a comment about that for whom the bell tolls on Twitch, actually, or on Periscope. Sorry, it was team stacking into 3-headed backfields. I could totally see this happening, Bloom, and the people just kind of adjusting to the new reality in the NFL. And leave it to me to be the one to bring this up, Bloom. But will we actually see maybe even more of a conservative approach? Because I think obviously numbers with an extra game, they're likely to improve. But I don't think we're going to see this explosion. Some teams will, like when you're on that roll, you will. Ravens in 2012, when they switch out of the Cam Cameron stuck in the 90s offense, right, and go to Jim Caldwell of all people. But like when you're on that type of momentum late in the year, you're going to keep that momentum going. But will we actually see some teams, maybe try to call off the dogs, easier game, easier matchup,
right?
Run the ball a little bit more, go a little bit, time of possession, a little more conservative to save themselves for later?
Well, didn't we see this last year, I think? Wasn't there a game last year where the opponent was kind of underwhelming and a lot of players that were game time decisions, they just sat them, and it was understood that if it was a different opponent or a different situation, they wouldn't have. I'm searching my brain for the teams, but I feel like this has already happened. And I think there's probably going to be things that are out of our view, right? We always learn at the end of the year, Stephon Diggs was playing through an oblique strain. Cole Beasley had a broken fibula, and so on. So I think teams have more information than we do to understand when a player might need a little extra time, when if there wasn't that extra game, especially, and I think the buy timing is really important too. So, if if players dinged in week 5, 6, 7, they don't have their buy until week 13 or 14, then they're going to be much more likely to be conservative. We always factor that in. So I do think that this is going to be something that we're going to have to kind of solve for X from the outside, and again, treat it on a team by team basis and watch which teams are being wise. But I absolutely think that even before there were 17 games, teams should have been looking into this. And I think the teams have access. One of the things you saw, if you're reading a lot of the post-draft articles, teams have all the data from the GPS now. Some teams don't even really care about 40 time anymore because they have players' top speeds and how quickly they accelerate and how long they can maintain the acceleration and things like that. So they already know. So I think there are teams that already are understanding this stuff from a sports science point of view. And as we said, if it was alluded to so many times, I think it's going to continue to separate the haves and the have-nots, or the teams that already are running their organization well from the teams that aren't.
So they pick a 148-pound wide receiver in the first round.
Well, it's because the thresholds are going down, right? Right. I mean, no. It's that. I mean, Tutu Atwell is going to be a real interesting guy to watch. But I think that we can look across the league at teams making maybe a meaningful conclusion from passing games, spreading the field out more, putting more players out on the field. Defenses are getting lighter, right? Now we have guys.
Listen, there's light, and then there's look up in the sky because a strong wind blew up under his jersey.
No doubt.
So but I'm with you. I do in theory. You're absolutely right. I think that's a good thing to point out.
And Rich Rebar called Tutu Atwell and Deshaun Jackson a pitch count player. There's another one for you, Cease Baseball.
Nice.
A pitch count player. And Sean McVay's been weird, right? Like Sean McVay's using these second round picks on guys like Gerald Everett and Van Jefferson, now Tutu Atwell, players who aren't going to be influencing the game on every down and aren't even necessarily going to be playing more than 50% of the snaps in a meaningful way. But he wants the pieces to fit the offense he wants to create. And I think that he sees now with Matthew Stafford the value of the vertical passing game being reinstated because, don't have to have Jared Goff at quarterback anymore. So I think that it makes sense that he would be a little bolder. But at the same time, all the draft analysts had Atwell as a second or third round pick. So maybe this is one, again, where the NFL is a little bit ahead because if defenses are getting lighter, like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is what, like 215, right?
At most.
Yeah. And so I think that the safety linebacker tweeners that we weren't sure what to do with, these guys fit right in today's NFL. And maybe there's a corresponding thing with the weight, height thresholds, at least a wide receiver.
Well, if we see another 15 players about that height and weight, I'll start to catch on to that idea. But until we start to see them, but these guys are outliers still at this point. But I see the possibility of that trend. But I look at this and I think, Sean McVay really loves all the massive, the great paint job and all the little gadgets in his car, but sometimes forgets about the engine, the suspension, and the axle.
Offensive line.
Yeah, that kind of thing, Right. Also making sure that the computer's aligned right so that you can drive in a straight line. So, but that's just me.
That is just Matt Waldman, Cecil Lammey, Sigmund Bloom here on the Audible Live, and you mentioned JOK. It's like, players like him, like Isaiah Simmons, if you know how to use him, that is, sorry, VJ, that's what you get in the National Football League. It's the Audible Live, and hey, if you're into shows like this one, then you're a serious fantasy player. But consistently winning at fantasy football is challenging, and it takes time. You need a Footballguys premium subscription that gives you an edge and helps you make winning decisions in less time. Like I've always said, you have a life. We don't. Let us handle that. So just head to footballguys.com, click the orange button in the upper right that says join now. That'll take you right to the early bird discount pricing. We'll do the work. You do the winning. It is footballguys.com. Does strength of schedule matter? Matt, let's start with you on that one. Is that everyone always is like, and everyone comes out of the woodwork and it's the greatest thing ever, or it doesn't matter, or the truth's always somewhere in between. But as I often think, what does Matt Waldman think about this? Well, let's find out.
Well, I certainly think that there's different ways to win leagues, and certainly everyone has their strengths. For me, strength of schedule matters most after week 4. That's basically how I like to look at it is that I tend not to use it until we've seen the opening month of the season, see how these changes with scheme, with free agents, additions with the draft, retirements, and all that turnover, and see how that fits with a team, and then get an idea of really how teams are going to adjust from there. So I think strength of schedule becomes a massively important thing to use after about week 8, becomes important to start to consider after week 4. And then I think it's worthwhile just to kind of, I guess, for me, the way I play, the style of how I play, it's nice to be aware of, but I don't put a lot of time into it until the season begins.
Bloom, what about you?
Is this a Steelers question? They have the toughest schedule.
Yeah, and the Broncos have like the easiest schedule. So.
Right. So, and by toughest schedule, I mean just going by last year's win-loss. And I know that's a really crude way to do it, but that's a starting point at least. And I think for fantasy football, and I haven't done my schedule analysis yet, I've been working hard on my 2021 projections. And please, folks, check them out. Actually, there's 5 set of projections for the season for free, including the marquee ones like Woodrow and Bob Henry. And the season-long projections, call me out. Tell me what you disagree with, because this is a process where we learn from each other. But we can learn a little bit from the schedule. I think we can still objectively, looking at depth charts, know which teams are going to be the teams likely that we want to avoid or target their pass defense, which teams likely want to avoid or target their run defense, or that new term funnel defenses like Tampa Bay. You're just not going to run on Tampa. No, I mean, why even bother trying to run on Tampa more than 15 or 20 times? So you can start to put in more pass attempts for some of these matchups. But for the Steelers in particular, and I'm going to try to break down like which teams, and I think in fantasy football, and I agree with what I think how I would characterize what Matt said. And again, I'm going to bring in Adam Harstad. Adam Harstad's head floats in and tells us that for the first 4 weeks of the season, ADP is as predictive as the previous weeks. So ADP is still going to guide you more towards valid outcomes than what happened in week 1 or week 2. Now you get to week 4. Now we have enough data to meaningfully say what we're working with this season. So I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. However, sticking your neck out a little bit for schedule strength, if you just look at the first 4 weeks or 3 weeks, and you want to get players that are going to get off to hot starts, and then, that's where the other 3 legs of the table, as Matt Mullen would put it, come in. Your transactions, trades, adds, drops, your lineup setting. But get the most out of your draft early with that schedule. And I'm going to be trying to look at that. And then, of course, we're going to look at the fantasy playoffs. But I'll take it all the way back to the Steelers, Cease, because this is a Steelers show, at least sometimes. Is it a bad thing for the Steelers to have the toughest schedule? I think it's a good thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They play up to their competition.
And they play down to their competition.
Right. So I think the last 4 teams to have the toughest schedule based on the previous year's win-loss all missed the playoffs. I think it was the Patriots last year. I think it was Denver back in like 2017. The Packers, one of those years, they went 6-9-1 with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. So there may be something to this, but it's good to find out. You got to be the best if you want to be the best. And I don't think any teams would be ducking that. And I just think for fantasy, I would just look at those first few weeks and try to find the soft underbelly defenses. Your Jets, your Houston, your Tennessee, these kind of defenses. Try to get those matchups early.
So I look like Cypress Hill Security. Or what'd you tell me before the show?
A little bit of Ali G,
Oh, a little Ali G. Yeah, I got that.
The glasses thing going on. Yeah, I can see that. And then I think of Adam Harstad's head floating around and him talking about chicken biscuits that he had to eat, in our base camp. I'm like I just get this image of him spilling chunks of chicken, like, as he's taking a bite, trying to, give us an eloquent explanation as to, all the things that Bloom was talking about here.
Well, and I'll say this, Bloom, and don't kick me out of Steelers Nation. I don't want to see him in the playoffs. a broken down Ben by that time,
right? Right. Well, you're talking about players who, and that's what we saw with the older quarterbacks last year, right? The quarterback they were in week 1 versus except for Tom Brady, of course, because he got the TV.
They'd have to do like the Broncos did with Brock, like go win 7 games with Brock Osweiler. He was 5-2, whatever,
right?
And then miraculously bring Ben back for the playoffs, and he pulls something out of his backside.
I want to see the Steelers play the Browns as much as possible right now.
Hey, and Cease, and this is going to make Matt Waldman smile, and this is going to make Cease sad. Mark Kabbally, I think that's how you say his last name, from The Athletic, he said if he had to handicap it today, he thinks maybe the most likely outcome is that Roethlisberger comes back for another year in 2022.
Not with Pittsburgh, though, right?
Yeah, if it's Pittsburgh. It's Mason Rudolph. They gave him an extension, so I don't even know.
Is his pocket going to be like the backfield going to be like Archie Bunker's favorite chair? Like, is that like we're going to have an image of Ben Roethlisberger in like in that old chair in All in the Family? We can just kind of
Zach Banner and Jukes Okafor. These guys better hold up. I mean,
what's
we're going to have Joe Haig.
Class of rule of 380. What was that old running back rule?
Yeah, 370.
370. Najee Harris, welcome to the club.
Yeah.
Gonna need him too. By the way, if you want teams to get off to a hot start, and I wrote about this today for denverfan.com, look at the Broncos. Those first 3 games, even if it's Drew Lock, and I know that sounds terrible, give him a chance. He deserves a chance. When does the NFL ever make you deserve anything? You earn it. So if you beat out Teddy, you earn it, I guess, unless they replace you with Aaron Rodgers. Anyway, okay, I would look at that. You've got the Giants, you've got the Jaguars, and you've got the Jets in the first 3 weeks. So your Broncos stock will be a little hotter anyway if you're drafting now before any sort of June 1st transaction that may or may not happen. Then that's something to look forward to, Matt. So identifying hot teams, I think it's the fun thing to do for me when the schedule is released. I go through and not only pick the Broncos for on-air purposes, and I have them at 10 wins this year, which may sound crazy, and that's without Aaron Rodgers. But I also like to look at, it used to be 14, 15, 16. Now it'll be 15, 16, 17 in terms of fantasy playoffs. Is that a yearly tradition of yours as well, sans the Broncos work?
Not really. I mean, to me, honestly, I don't even look at strength. I don't even look at the schedule right now. Right now, I'm just... for me, it's more about who these players are, what the scheme is, how they're going to fit, any coaching changes. And that's the balance of what I'm looking at this point, because I'm not going to, I kind of think that the numbers kind of average out. You're going to have better weeks and bad weeks because, even with an easier schedule, there's 1 or 2 teams that might be the exception for, but where they might be hot all year long. And if you guess that right team, you've been able to calculate for the players. But to me, I think that's a little bit of overthinking. I'd rather just know that there's going to be good weeks and bad weeks pretty much with every team. And then adjust from there to see which team's hot, because with my luck, I'll pick a team that I think is going to have a really hot start, and all those teams fall on their face the first 5 weeks, and it's like, great, I've put too much weight on this, as opposed to kind of diversifying what I do. That ends up getting me. That's for me the biggest part is I don't want to overthink certain things where I end up having favorites early on that I'm trying to draft and lean too hard on. I'd rather just kind of look at it across the board, and that way I'm more likely to diversify my draft, and it makes it easier for you to make adjustments as a result, because it's less likely that I've weighed too much on, because I've done that before where I've weighed, like last year I did it. I weighed so much on the Buccaneers, and the Buccaneers started poorly, and I had Gronk, I had Howard, I had Brady, I had Godwin. None of that really worked out very well for me for the teams that I did that with, and I had to make major adjustments. And did they finish hot? Absolutely. Didn't help me, from my season, from a fantasy perspective. The teams that I stayed away from that, I ended up doing much better.
It's like Joe Mixon's. It's like Joe Mixon going off every December. Well, not last December.
Remember them saying Joe Mixon's going to carry a big load. Well, that's
Samaje
great.
Perine,
right? And then that happens because what is it about, Sigmund? It's about windows.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks fantasy football is like love. It's forever. Or at least what we hope love would be. Like, no, it's not. Fantasy football's not love. Fantasy football.
Infatuation.
It's second grade with the little paper thing, you know.
Right. Check yes or no. Can I start you this week? Check yes or no. That's what fantasy football is about. So, Bloom, with that being said, does it bother you at all? For example, because I think of tough defenses. And I think the Broncos on paper are a top 5 defense, could be best in the league. I think that Washington might be the best defense in the league. So if I'm going to tell you in week 17, in the championship week of fantasy playoffs, Philadelphia is playing Washington. Does that ding it at all for a Jalen Hurts? That Los Angeles is going to, the Chargers are going to be playing the Broncos in the fantasy championship. Does that ding Herbert at all? We've been talking about Keenan Allen. I know windows, all these sorts of things, but when you think, okay, this defense is a mother, you know what, YouTube overlords, but I don't want to face those. Does it ding it at all? Is it any sort of consideration, even if it's the smallest tiebreaker?
I wouldn't say week 17 isolated, but I do think that you can look ahead at a schedule and you can see runs that could get a team hot. By the way, I want to point out that you did a good one, Cecil, with Denver. Carolina, their first 4 weeks, and this could be important for Sam Darnold. By the way, he plays the Jets week 1. Too bad Adam Gase isn't still the coach. A real revenge game. New Orleans, Houston, and Dallas. So the Jets, Houston, and Dallas in 3 of the first 4 weeks. If you're looking for Darnold's confidence, and this can play into narrative street. I'm narrative street after all. You're looking for Darnold to get off to a start that is a little easier for him, that rebuilds his confidence, that makes his teammates and his coaches, everybody kind of buy in. That could be the start. But Cecil, I'll give you another one on the tail end. Let's talk about Trey Lance. Yeah. Guess who Trey Lance gets? That's Trey Lance. Maybe it's Jimmy Garoppolo. Let's pretend it's Jimmy Garoppolo for a second. Weeks 15, 16, and 17. Atlanta, Tennessee, and Houston. Oh, my. Hot knife through butter, baby. I think that it looks like just me and you.
I know,
and now we're out of the three pain. So exactly. I need to go have that here. And see,
it was so good.
I thought we were playing paintball for a minute there on that one.
Yeah. Cecil just blew a microchip when I said that schedule.
Yeah.
So you know what?
I got to go get Trey Lance right now.
Well, and I think we can look ahead and we can look at those schedules and we can see, Tennessee, on the other hand, has Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Miami. So that's one that might say, well, how, especially a team like Pittsburgh in week 15, San Francisco in week 16, how's that going to go for Tennessee? But like Matt said, I think this is something better to revisit, say around week 5, 6, 7, because one of the players, for instance, and it worked out, maybe accelerated with Tariq Cohen's injury. But if you were looking at the Bears schedule around week 5, 6, 7, 8 last year, you could see a run of games coming up for them that for David Montgomery was just going to be beautiful. It was going to be exactly what you wanted. If you look back at the schedule, they had Detroit, Houston, Minnesota. I remember Minnesota's defense was not good. It was coming around, but Jacksonville, that was weeks 13 to 16. And partway into the season, you could see that those were 4 of the worst 8 or 10 defenses in the league. And not just the quality of the defense, but these were teams that weren't that competitive, with the exception of maybe Minnesota. So you knew that Montgomery, on top of playing a weak defense, was going to get great conducive game scripts to his production. And sure enough, you look down that stretch, had 143 total yards and a touchdown against, that was Green Bay. He had, 111 and 2 touchdowns against Detroit, 155 yards and a touchdown against Houston, 162 yards and 2 touchdowns against Minnesota, and then only 121 total yards and a touchdown against Jacksonville. So I think we check in sometime in October, and then we can really make some meaningful buy low for the playoffs or sell high, get out of the way, get out of a schedule that looks like a steamroller based on which defenses are coming together.
I think these examples that Bloom brings up are really good arguments for why it probably isn't good to get too attached to strength of schedule right away. And the reason being is that I think that the best fantasy players, for the most part, are flexible and make changes in season. If you're not able to adjust in season oftentimes if you're doing things that make you have a set mind early on, that may contribute to that type of mindset and behavior that you want to avoid. So if you're looking at it from a standpoint of, hey, look, when you say Justin Herbert against the Broncos, well, Justin Herbert against anybody sounds pretty good compared to Jalen Hurts against somebody. It doesn't mean that Jalen Hurts won't have a good season, but if I'm going to pick either player, I'm taking Justin Herbert far more often than I'm taking Jalen Hurts, as well as the players who he's throwing the football to right now this year, until I see proof otherwise. So for me, the idea of him facing Denver doesn't scare me as much. But in first 5 weeks of the season, Washington could, I don't know, the cheerleaders could have revenge on the organization, and next thing we know, we have like some bad buffet, and and half the defense is out with the stomach flu.
Offensive line injuries, I think, is a big one here too.
Exactly, and next thing you know, Jalen Hurts against Washington is about as good as Jalen Hurts against the 76 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And then you're and at that point it sounds great. But right now, it's just not enough to know.
Is that the team that they asked the coach, what do you think of your team's
about their execution?
Yeah. He said, I'm all for it. John McKay?
Yeah.
Who was?
Yeah, and his son played, J.K. McKay. Yeah. They showed a hit of him once, and he literally flew about 10 yards in the air. He kind of did a Tutu Atwell imitation.
It was an Atwell hit. Yeah. Well, now with GPS data, you can see the crash statistics as well. Like
exit velocity.
He's good as long as he doesn't run into this player at this speed.
Did he orbit Jupiter? That's what I want to know.
Jupiter's Legacy.
Right.
Now on Netflix. Anyway.
#1.
Yeah, there you go. #1 in your hearts. It's Matt Waldman, Sigmund Bloom, Cecil Lammey here on the Audible Live. We got about 5 minutes left. Bloom, you wanted to ask me something.
Oh, yeah, about Big Al. About Big Al.
Big Al. Mm-hmm.
So Big Al, and you don't see Big Al breaking news on Twitter very often. It wasn't really news. It was scuttlebutt, buzz, rumor. He said that Rodgers, Green Bay, he's hearing they're close to a deal. He brought up that Love's not ready to play, which obviously could give Green Bay a sense of urgency. And I think it was Matt Schneiderman from The Athletic that said, if it seems like that the Packers brass are begging Aaron Rodgers to play this year through their public comments, that's because that's what they're doing. So anything you want to add to that, knowing that you and Big Al are, you're pretty tight?
Yeah, Big Al's a good dude. And kind of like with the Stink thing, when Stink says what he said on draft night, like Stink doesn't break news, but he's going to tell you what he's hearing. Al's hearing this. Ian Rappaport actually reported on it Tuesday afternoon that they are working on a massive contract. I think it was Pat McAfee's show that said it could be more than Mahomes. Okay, but Gutenkirst is still there. And Matt, if this guy's dug in, he and I don't want to bring up family stuff because it's his family stuff and nobody's really clear on the whys. But like, if this guy shunned his own family for his reasons, Green Bay, throw all the money you want at him. If it's over, it's over.
Yeah, I think that you could look at it from two angles. You could talk about the family thing from a bad angle, and that's probably what most people will think because that's just how that's the main assumption. Or you could look at it as someone who has some conviction and I don't even know the story with his family, but I'll say this: if it could also be that he might have some boundaries, he might be healthy, he might decide that the family that he's with isn't, and all it does is cause him more pain, distraction, and it'd be something that even any therapist might say, yeah, you need to kind of put them aside because they're gonna torture you for the rest of their life, or for your lifetime. Right. So again, I'm not one to say I don't know the situation, but I'll say this is that it'd be smart for them to try and kiss and make up with him as much as possible, though I would absolutely love to see Chad Kelly have an opportunity.
Yes.
One more time.
Preseason at least.
He has definitely paid. He has definitely paid me. I've mentioned him on every RSP episode at least once a week for the past 2 years. It's like the running joke on my show is that I have to get a Chad Kelly reference in somehow.
Nice.
But it'd be kind of fun from that angle if they were desperate enough that they had to go with a talented quarterback that nobody wants as their starter, for good reasons, as we've seen. But yeah, if Jordan Love, I mean, seriously, this guy was
everybody knows
never should have been. Never should have been a first round pick. Third to fifth round, let him sit for 2 to 3 years. Yeah, then you have something possible there. But of course, Aaron Rodgers is going to be angry about that. If you don't tell your most valued employee, maybe the most valuable employee in the league, that you're drafting his successor, and he just shows up to work and they're like, yeah, here's your successor. You're going to have to help train him because we're just betting on you, like basically falling apart within the next year or two, and not even say anything about it. Yeah, that's going to rub anybody the wrong way, even if they handle it in a more dignified fashion, possibly, than what Aaron Rodgers did.
Bloom, all that being said, I still think he's a Denver Bronco.
Well, Aaron Rodgers, as I brought this up with Bob Harris, our Uncle Bob, on the couch this week. I used to joke that Aaron Rodgers has a list of everybody who's ever said anything bad about him ever. I mean, he holds grudges, and we don't even need to get into the family stuff. And like Matt said, we shouldn't, because it's personal. So based on the things that have come out, if they are true, it's hard to see this getting mended. And something else, I think Eric Stoner was the first one to bring this up, that the Packers don't have a traditional owner, right? They don't have an owner who can just come in and say, fire Gutekunst, give him $45 million a year. Let's move on. Let's just move on. This is ridiculous. We have one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history. We're going to keep that quarterback until he decides he doesn't want to play football anymore.
Heck, Tom Brady's branded his grudges.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I know. Exactly.
He turned it into a brand. I mean, if Baker Mayfield makes it, he might do the same thing. He has that you said he had that. I think Cecil's mentioned that he kind of had a big chip on his shoulder, before the draft. So a lot of these guys do. I mean, Michael Jordan. I mean, it's his retirement.
That's
ceremony,
when it became personal.
and he's dissing everybody at his retirement.
He's dissing his high school coach
at his Hall of Fame.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's when it became to the Hall of Fame is the greatest of all time. You know what it's like, Bloom? It's exactly like this meme, which is horrible for people, but he's like Anakin Skywalker. He's going to have a list, and if you play nice, hey, maybe he'll cross your name off the list.
Arya had a list. I like Arya.
Yeah. That place where she learned how to change her face. That was the best story in Game of Thrones. But Cease, we have to wind the show up because you have to start studying the Bobby Massey, Cam Fleming right tackle battle. That's going to be the most gripping thing that happens in training camp for the Denver Broncos.
I know, and I even have an alarm set on my phone. So I'm like, oh yeah, don't forget you have a show. But this show, the closest to my heart, it is the Audible Live. Everyone out there, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for listening to the show. Thanks for subscribing to our YouTube channel. And make sure you do all those YouTube things, like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss a vid. And if you're like our man Derek in the chat room, go back and re-hit the notification bell, because sometimes YouTube just unsubscribes people from things because we don't know why. So there you go. As the alarm goes off, that means it is a wrap, everyone. He's Matt Waldman. Check out the rookie scouting portfolio and everything you need to know at mattwaldmanrsp.com. Sigmund Bloom, you follow him on Twitter at Sigmund Bloom. Check out his projections at footballguys.com. And I'm Cecil Lammey saying thanks, everybody. Stay tuned. And as always, stay frosty.
We'll keep the good fight against the